Hello, this is Jason Davis. I'm the Master Executive Council Scheduling Committee Chair for AFA at Frontier, and this video series is an introduction to preferential bidding in Flica. We're calling it Line Bidding 101. It will be very basic for new bidders here at Frontier Airlines. So where do I start? First, each month you want to review the bid packet, either a paper bid packet that's available in your crew room, or you can see the first 2 pages of the bid packet under Bid Update in Flica each month when bidding opens on the 6th. The first 2 pages of the bid packet have a lot of important information, including the projected number of bidders in each base, the projected number of line holders and reserves in each base. Obviously, some changes can be made right up until the last day of bidding to those numbers. The biggest thing to focus on is the number of reserves is likely to remain the same. So if the number of bidders goes down by 5, the number of line holders will also go down by 5. The number of reserves will likely stay the same. Between this and when you're entering the live bid folder, you can see your actual bidding seniority. You need to really understand what your relative bidding seniority in your base is. Here's an example. If you're in a base with 600 bidders, and there's going to be 120 reserves, that leaves roughly 480 lines. If you're bidder number 240 of the 480, you're right in the middle of the line holders. So not the top third, not the bottom third. Understanding where you fall in your base is very important to understanding what you can and can't hold in your bid. In Flica, it's important to understand that it is a computer program, and that it only is as good as the information we put into it. One of the most important things, it's not a person, it is a computer that runs our bids. The most important thing to understand about Flica is that pop-up windows include everything. First, you'll need to turn off any pop-up blocker when you're bidding, especially if you're working on a company computer. But every time you bid, each action you take is in a pop-up window. The pop-up windows include the description of what it is that this pop-up window is doing. Read and understand the entire pop-up window before you hit apply or submit to ensure that you know what it's going to be doing. Another thing to keep in mind is each preference or each line is its own thing. Once the computer reads it and goes past it, it doesn't remember what the previous line says, it doesn't know what the next line is going to say. So it's very important that you tell the computer on every single line what you want the computer to know at that time in your bid. Defining a few terms. In Flica, when you set your bid, there is a scheduled build option at the top of the window. And in a moment, I'll actually run through building a live bid. So you may not be able to see it in this screen here, but you'll be able to see it later. The scheduled build options is the only line of your bid that is considered throughout your bid. It's also sometimes referred to as a global option. And that's where you can set things like your personal credit threshold, your position preferences between the positions on the aircraft, and you can set things like maximum days on in a row or minimum days off in a row. Please, and I will say this again in this video, do not use both the maximum days on and a minimum days off, one or the other only. A preference. A preference is basically a line of your bid. Each preference can contain up to 10 conditions. I'll get a little more into that later on. So when you first click on Add a Preference on your bid, the first thing that will come up is a pop-up window that looks like this one here that says Preference Manager. There's a drop-down menu that says Select a Condition to Add. That is where you start selecting the conditions to go into that preference. Again, a little more when I get to the actual building of the bid later. A condition are the different parameters you can set from that drop-down menu that make up a preference line. Once again, you can have up to 10 conditions on a preference line. Each preference line will only meet trips that match all of the conditions on that line that haven't already been matched by a previous line in your bid. At the bottom of the bid window in Flica every month, there is a helpful hints that literally breaks down how to put together a bid and how the computer will read and award your bid, but it's almost oversimplified. The helpful hints can use a little explanation. I'm not going to read through all the words on this PowerPoint as we go through, but it will be available to look at our AFA Frontier website. Once again, read every pop-up window when they come up. The schedule build options pop-up window includes a lot of information. It literally includes some red asterisks that lead to red text that are warnings. They're both literal and figurative red flags. So definitely read every pop-up window, but pay particular attention to the red text. So here are the helpful hints that shows on the bottom of Flica. One of them I've already mentioned. A preference can have up to 10 conditions. I won't necessarily read them all through, but these appear every month in Flica, and from 6 years experience working on this committee, I can tell you many bidders do not read them. So the first one of those helpful hints says a preference can contain up to 10 conditions. All right. Important conditions, something that you find very important for your personal bid, should be included on every line. An example is if you do not want red eye trips and you only put do not select red eyes on the first line, well, the very next line of your bid, if it doesn't also include the condition don't select red eyes, that very next line can match red eyes. So it's important, whatever your most important condition is, it probably should be part of every line and perhaps only by itself on the very last line of your bid. One other thing to mention about preference lines is that each bidder is limited to no more than 200 total preferences. Your schedule build options, which shows above line 1 while you're bidding, actually becomes line 1 once you start bidding. The last line of each bid sheet, which is pairings not included in this bid sheet on the first and or second bid sheet, and all remaining pairings on whatever your last bid sheet is, also count against that line allowance. So by an example, if you use a schedule build options and you use 2 bid sheets, then you can submit up to a total of 196 lines between the 2 bid sheets because the 2 SBOs and the 2 final lines will also be added in as part of the 200 total limit. Add conditions to a pairing line until only equally desirable pairings are grouped together. What does this mean? In a nutshell, you're saying, if I match these lines on this one trip, you're telling the system, I like all of these trips the same. Now, if that's a true statement, great, they can be on the same line. If however, any of those trips are more desirable than others of those trips, the more desirable ones should be on a higher line, separate from the less desirable ones, which should be on a lower line. Your schedule will be built in the priority of your preferences. If you have a first preference line that matches most of the bid packet, and many of those trips are available, and it can assign you an entire schedule just from the trips on line 1, it will do so, and it will never even read line 2. One of the biggest mistakes people make is putting on line 1 just a condition for their days off. And then, for example, maybe on line 2 they put no stand-ups. Well, line 1 matched every stand-up that didn't touch their days off. They could be awarded an entire month of stand-ups from line 1, and the system never even reads line 2 to see, oh, he or she didn't want stand-ups. So that's why it's important. Conditions that are important to you should be part of every line. In general, first line of your bid should be a lot of conditions and very few matches. As you go down the bid, take conditions away or make them less restrictive to get more matches. Once that computer reaches either your personal threshold, above your personal threshold, or above the company threshold if you don't set a personal threshold, it will stop right there in the bid. Using multiple bid sheets. If you use more than one bid sheet and it cannot assign your entire schedule from sheet 1, it will wipe out what it tried to give you from sheet 1 and start with a blank bid at the top of sheet 2. This is not a bad strategy if you have a completely different strategy between sheet 1 and sheet 2. For example, sheet 1 you can request all weekday CDOs because you have somebody who can look after your kids when you're away on weeknights. But if you can't have all weekday stand-ups, sheet 2 requests 4-day trips over the weekends because you have someone else who can watch your kids between Friday and Sunday. So, one thing to keep in mind, if you use more than one bid sheet, the computer will try to build your schedule only from sheet 1 if it can, including sometimes not meeting your own personal threshold as long as it can at least meet the minimum schedule. So, bear that in mind if you want to use multiple bid sheets. As a very junior bidder, I don't generally recommend it. Using both max days on and min days off is not advised. One or the other conditions, please. it becomes way too restrictive if you use both, and especially if you use both and use multiple bid sheets, this can cause major hangups with the runs. Every month on the 12th, me and the other members of the committee are calling people desperate for, you've got to change your bid sheet. It's holding up the run. Please don't be one of these people that we call to say, we told you not to do max days on and min days off. Please change your bid. Basically, if you're not in the top 20% of your base, you should never use both those options. Okay, some of the most common conditions, I've got a list of them here. I'm actually going to go through them kind of one by one. Days on, pretty straightforward. You tell the computer, these are the days I want to work. Days off, you tell the computer, these are the days I do not want to work. With the days off, you can actually set a time range. Say, for example, you need Friday off, but you only need Friday off after 2 p.m. You can choose Friday off, apply a time range from 2 p.m. to midnight, and as a way of telling the computer, it's okay to finish a trip Friday morning just as long as I'm done by 2 p.m., as an example. Pairing actually allows you to select specific trips. Bear in mind when you set up just by pairing number, some of those pairings may repeat throughout the month. The condition for specific pairing allows you to choose both the pairing number and the date of operation that you want to choose. So that's a little more specific. Again, these are things you probably don't want to get into until you're quite senior in your base. As a very junior bidder, you're probably not bidding specific pairings yet. Credit hours allows you to select pairings with a certain amount of credit, meaning total credit for the trip. So that can include deadhead credit or stand-up credit or things like that. Block hours allows you to select pairings based on the amount of block time in them. And I'll go into a little bit more when I start showing you an actual live bid. Anything that's numeric, you can say I want it to be above this number, below this number, between these two numbers, not between these two numbers. There's a few different options in the drop-downs for these conditions. CDO pairings is pretty straightforward. It allows you to say either you do want stand-ups or you don't want stand-ups. Red-eye pairings is the same thing. Either you do want red-eye pairings or you don't want red-eye pairings. Length of pairing allows you to choose trips based on the number of calendar days it operates on. Date of pairing allows you to select the specific dates that the pairing departs. I believe that's actually called departure dates. And that's just the date that the trip will start, not necessarily the day it will end. If it's longer than a one-day trip, it would start on the departure date and end however many days later. Average credit per day is one that I highly advise using. It is a great way to bid for trips based on their credit, but it takes the total credit of the trip and divides by the number of calendar days it operates. The example I always use is an 18-hour 3-day is a pretty good 3-day. An 18-hour 4-day is not so great. So if you had an average credit per day of at least 6 hours, that would cover at least an 18-hour 3-day or at least a 24-hour 4-day or a 12-hour 2-day. So that's why I like average daily credit a lot as an option, as a condition. Block hours per pairing is, again, a way of setting a pairing preference based on total block hours of the pairing. Here's a little example of block versus credit. Some pairings will have things like deadheads in them, and so they'll actually have a little more credit than they have block. Again, another reason I like the average credit per day condition. I don't mind a deadhead every now and then. If you're strictly interested in trips that don't have deadheads and have a set number of block hours, then you can bid by block hours, or you can even put in a preference for or a condition for no deadheads. Duty period release is the time the trip releases to a layover. Not necessarily the last day of the trip. That is a separate condition called release time, which shows on your bid as pairing release after you select it. Duty period report, again, is for the report time on days 2 or higher in the trip. There's a separate condition called report time that is for specifically the first day of the trip, or the pairing report time. Duty period length, again, allows you to say either you do or don't want longer duty days. Legs on first duty period is one that is quite popular for folks that commute, especially if they're going to commute in. They'd like a trip that maybe starts with just one leg to an outstation, since they've already spent a lot of their time commuting in that day. Legs on last duty period, same thing again. You can either say, I want 3 legs on the last day or only 1 leg on the last day as a way to try and control what time you end your trip. This is an example of one of my personal bids from a previous month. I'm actually going to build a little bit of something later on in this video presentation using my bid as a basis. Now, each time a line is entered, a preference line is entered, there will be a new matches column that has a little magnifying glass next to it that will show you the trips that have been matched by that line that hadn't already been matched by a previous line. It's a great way of doing a QA check and making sure the line is actually matching the kind of trips you want it to. Here is an example from Kimberly McCullen's bid. She is senior enough in her base. You can see her bidder number is number 58 of 518. So she's senior enough to pick specific trips she wants, and this is an example of a bid put in where she has bid for specific trips, and then she has got, starting on line 7, some very general lines in order to cover her in case she doesn't just get her schedule built from her specific trips. Going back 1 second to my bid, I don't know if you can see in this, I was 289 of 569, which is why I bid with very general bidding, not specific trips. So on a completed bid sheet, there is a preview option that lets you look at the preferences you put in. It shows you the pairings in a slightly different format. It actually shows them to you on a calendar so you can see how they might line up. It's obviously not an actual schedule. It's just if you were to get these trips, here's how it would look on a calendar. All right. All remaining pairings is always the final line of the final bid sheet of everybody's bid. If the system gets to all remaining pairings before it has assigned you enough credit to meet thresholds, you will get any and all trips that are left in any way the computer wants to give them to you. In general, you want to avoid having your trips assigned from all remaining pairings. Seldom are the results pretty. So, bidding is complex. Part of the reason we tell you to look at the bid packet every month is our email is on there, f9prefbid@afafrontier.org. Please email us with your questions. Myself or one of the other members of the committee will be happy to answer and go and help you with the process. So next I'm going to actually go to Flica and build a bid from scratch. So part 2 of the video will be coming up and will include me putting together a live bid in Flica, going through and showing some of the conditions we discussed in this part 1.